Hey there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec. Just this past Monday was a big ban announcement, including the ban of Nadu from Modern, which is a well-deserved ban, and of course this has got a lot of people talking. In addition to this, Wizards of the Coast released an article from MH3's lead designer Michael Majors that discussed how Nadu became what it is. And because that article is pretty candid about how Nadu's original text was changed as a result of concerns for how it would operate in Commander gameplay, this is, of course, quite relevant to those of us in the EDH space. So let's chat about it, because it stirred up a lot of discussion about bannings and about format philosophy. And real quick, by the way, if you do the YouTube things, and the next game that you'll play, you'll get a perfect opening hand. You won't have to mulligan at all. I don't know if that's true, but you might as well test the theory out, right? Anyway, let's examine some stuff. So in his article, Michael Major starts off very upfront. Nadu was a design mistake, and I think he's quite frank about owning it. He was the set lead, and he accepts responsibility. The real thing that's caught everyone's attention, though, is that Nadu's original text was apparently this. Same stats, but giving all your permanent spells flash, and doing the top deck benefit only when your opponents target your stuff. However, in meetings, a concern was raised about that flash ability being too good for Commander, which eventually caused the card's text to change into the format-wrecking bird we know now. So this is my first pit stop, the concept of designing cards explicitly for EDH players. A thorny subject, to say the least. It's no secret that players have frustrations with cards that are designed explicitly for Commander. This is a thing I even mentioned in a previous rapid-fire video I did a short time ago. And we're especially vocal about how we don't like it when designs for EDH come at the expense of the health of other formats. No, but like seriously, 60-card players who blame EDH players for all of the design problems that have been happening in constructed formats over the past couple of years, we think it's annoying too. We are with you on this. I'll echo that concern again here, but there is a distinction I'd like to make. Making Commander-explicit cards in a set that is deliberately geared for a completely different format, the modern format, yes, that's silly. I've made no secret of my exhaustion over it, like when they released the Commander precons for Modern Horizons, which ironically contained a bunch of cards that aren't legal in Modern despite the product having Modern Horizons in its name, but those cards are legal in other older formats. It's just... And it's a shame, because I actually think several of those MH3 precons are very clever designs. The Omo deck is especially really unique. I can appreciate that. I just also think it's weird to bend a modern labeled product to the whims of EDH. Even EDH players think that's bunk. Even Commander players don't want that. The distinction worth drawing, though, is that it's not just about cards being designed for EDH as a general principle. It's about when cards are designed for EDH at the expense of other formats. And this distinction is worth making because, obviously, cards designed for EDH are popular. Some go way too far. There are some designs that I think are super overdoing it, but stuff like the Monarch, that's a multiplayer mechanic that players love. I personally am a big fan of cards like Take the Bait, which would never be designed in a one-on-one set. And designing cards with Commander in mind can have some enormous long-term benefits. Grey Merchant of Asphodel, for instance, is not the kind of thing that we see anymore. I'm not saying it's an overpowered card or anything, I'm just saying Wizards recognize they probably shouldn't make a lot more cards whose effects work or scale the way that Grey Merchant does in multiplayer environments, because a high density of those would be kind of egregious in those types of formats. So they changed the way that similar such effects work in future sets. And frankly, I think the format is better for that change in direction. And crucially, that type of change doesn't negatively impact one-on-one formats. I think the issue of Boros and mono white in Commander is a relevant data point here too. Boros was clowned on in EDH for many years because it wasn't as capable as other color combos in multiplayer. This is kind of an example of players literally asking Wizards of the Coast to make cards for the Commander format. Crucially, Wizards was put into the spot of having to find ways of improving white's status in EDH without those card designs affecting tournament play. You know, the color of universal removal and tons of board wipes is probably not the color that you also want to have lots of inherent and impactful card advantage, because that could overpower other tournament archetypes. And I personally think that Wizards has done a pretty good job of threading that needle. White feels more compelling and sustainable in EDH, and at least to me, it doesn't feel like it's gotten too big for its britches in places like Standard. Point being, not all forms of designing stuff for Commander are unhealthy. I just think that's a distinction worth noting, because it's a nuance that I see get lost in these conversations a lot. Designing for Commander can produce some really interesting cards that people really like. The problem is designs for Commander that compromise the health of other formats, and Modern Horizons 3 provided an especially exaggerated example of this by making Legends that broke Modern even when Commander players were never asking for something of Nadu's caliber. Seriously, the only thing clowned on more than Boros in EDH was Simic in EDH doing predictable ramp and card draw things. The Commander players were not happy to see another blue-green broken combo engine. So why the heck is Wizards of the Coast putting cards meant for Commander into the Modern Horizons 3 set? Money. It's just the case that Commander is so popular that the casual kitchen table player base is so big that Wizards can make a pretty safe bet when designing a set, that if that set appeals to EDH players even a little bit, that will help boost sales. Sort of like I can't always guarantee that my Red Elemental Blast will work on every opponent, but my Chaos Warp is always a pretty safe bet because it can hit anything. The thing is, those safe bets aren't so safe under certain conditions, and that leads me to the next point about this article. My second pit stop is a point about transparency. I think it takes a lot to write what Michael Majors wrote. Admitting fault is hard. Mea culpas are hard, especially in front of a fan base this big and this active. And frankly, the fact that we get any transparency from Wizards about this stuff is impressive. Have you seen Yu-Gi-Oh! Players react to hearing how much behind-the-scenes information Magic gives to its player base? A lot of other game studios are significantly more tight-lipped. We've been given a lot of behind-the-scenes details over the years, and that's something that I personally want to make sure I never take for granted. Just because I've gotten it in the past doesn't mean I'm always entitled to it. I can't help but focus on this section of the article, though. We know Nadu's original Flash ability got removed, and then, I don't know. The statement is that the card needed to find an audience. They wanted to make a build-around for Commander play, and that resulted in the final text. Which is just hazy, is all. There's kind of a jump from removing the flash text to the end result. Like how the writer of only effects and opponent controls got removed, or skipping past only triggers once per turn right into twice per turn. Some of those details just aren't given much explanation. I'm not upset about it, and again, I don't think anyone owes me that information. It's nice that we got any information. I just observe that that part feels vague in a way that the rest of the article doesn't, which makes me go, huh. And that moment is amplified even more when I read on and see other descriptions of how little time the design team had to playtest their designs once a couple of last-minute changes were made. Now, let's not mince any words here. The point I'm making isn't about any individual designer or design team. In fact, I think it's a little dumb to direct blame towards just an individual. Antagonizing an individual is especially inappropriate, and I don't think curious, good Magic players would stoop to that kind of behavior. Only incurious and bad Magic players that jump to conclusions would do foolish things like that. And our audience here is far too cool to behave that way. No, the point I'm making is to once again express concern about how Wizards' current direction affects designers' ability to properly vet the cards that they've been tasked with producing at an ever-accelerated rate. My co-host Matt put it better than I can. Tripling the output that designers need to create without tripling their resources is going to result in a ton more situations like this one. Individual designers don't have the power to change commands from down on high, they just have to try to keep up with that demand. And producing at that pace inevitably means errors are gonna get through. That's when the safe bets stop being safe. I'm sure MH3 sold very well, and I'm sure that appealing to the Commander crowd had plenty to do with that. I'm also sure that it's much harder to measure the costs associated with players who avoided the modern stuff because of situations like Nadu. I believe there's a very big impact there. I believe the impact that such cards have on player excitement is a big marketing loss, but I understand why that type of potential loss would be so hard to detail on a report to show to the higher-ups who decide which way the ship is going. It's the same reason that so many movies nowadays are nostalgia bait and remakes. Executives will point to a thing that previously made the line go up, and they say, do that again, which leaves less room for employees to do the riskier projects. Some of those riskier projects and creative new ideas could be much more profitable, but since they could also bomb, they're more likely to be avoided in favor of, well, we've seen this work before. The result is, therefore, blander entertainment, pale imitations. There are a lot of crap movies out there desperately trying and drastically failing to capture the magic of other more successful projects that were huge hits precisely because they took bigger risks. I think that applies to the movie-making industry, and I think it's kind of the same thing happening in Magic now. And I'm grateful to the creative designers who are trying their best to fight against that, even when their hands are tied. That's something on the company side, but there's something I want to address on the player side, too. I have a third pit stop to make. It's not about the article, but rather about the lead up to and reactions to these recent bans and announcements. This ban of cards in other formats that Wizards of the Coast explicitly controls have been contrasted against the Commander Rules Committee, which hasn't made a ban since Golos' ban and Worldfire's unban in 2021. So, transparently, a lot of the rhetoric I've seen has been kind of frustrating. I hope I'm able to be productive about it. A lot of the sentiment can be boiled down to, we don't need a rules committee, abolish the rules committee. What's even the purpose of a rules committee? What do they even do? And a significant part of the conversation, the one that's most related to the issue of bannings, is an accusation that the rules committee is just resting on its laurels and relying upon players to self-regulate with things like Rule Zero, so that they, the rules committee, don't have to take any big actions. And these arguments make the case that this is ridiculous because they say Rule Zero doesn't even work. I realize I'm going to get accused of trying to suck up no matter what I actually say, but I'll try saying this anyway. I don't care to white knight for either Wizards of the Coast or the Rules Committee. I don't work with or for either of those bodies. What concerns me about statements like these is the amount of pain that they reveal to be present in the Magic player base. Maybe that sounds melodramatic, I don't know, but yeah, it's about the health of the community. Honestly, comments like those feel the same way to me as comments that come from 60-card players who blame Commander players for the issues that happen with Constructed. Like, yeah, Constructed formats getting wrecked or bent around the casual format is frustrating. Every set catering to the Commander crowd is frustrating. And it's true, the kitchen table player base is so big that Commander players will eat up those EDH angled cards no matter what set those cards are in, which is why Wizards keeps appealing to them. That's a genuinely deep frustration to encounter over and over, and it's only amplified by how powerless any of us are to stop it. But Commander players didn't design any of those cards. Commander players can barely even agree with each other about what's best for the format. We're not one monolithic conglomerate. So taking out that genuine frustration on an EDH player base just kind of feels like, what are you doing? We actually agree with you on a whole lot of this stuff. Yes, Commander players buy the cards, but you also buy a lot of those cards. So just feel like that's not the enemy to point at. And I feel the same way about those blaming EDH players' comments as I do about the recent rhetoric I've seen about Rule Zero. I see, again, a genuine expression of frustration that comes from a true place that's getting redirected at the wrong thing. I probably need to lay some groundwork here real quick, because we all colloquially say Rule Zero conversations, but it's worth noting that that term isn't really describing the original concept of Rule Zero. The original concept of Rule Zero is about how the Rules Committee encourages you to try silly out-of-bounds things if you want to. In their own words, they don't have an enforcement arm. They're not going to bang down your door to force you to play a certain way. If something outside the rules sounds fun, try it out, as long as you're not a butthead about it, because it's just kind of gauche for one player at the pod to force their vision onto the rest of the table. Rule Zero conversation has just been conflated with the same idea as pregame chat, and those terms have kind of been squashed together. The idea of a pregame chat, of course, being a way to make sure that everyone's on the same page before gameplay actually begins, so that everyone gets the experience that they want to have from that game, and often to make sure that the deck's power levels are not crazy out of balance. So when people say Rule Zero doesn't work, what they mean is that pregame chats are ineffective at producing a balanced game that everyone will enjoy. And if that's your experience, that's a frustrating experience. If you don't have a regular play group, you rely upon strangers to play at all, and maybe those strangers are playing in a way that you don't want to, or maybe you do have a regular play group, but some of the folks in that play group play in ways that you don't want to, that sucks. That means that basically all the time, the only way that you get to play Magic at all is to play in ways that you don't even like. That frustration intensifies when Magic is accelerating the rate of products, and some of those products produce increased power creep. That frustration intensifies more when there are some standout cards that those players feel are especially egregious, or especially the culprit. Dockside Extortionist is a very prominent example of this right now. If Dockside produces game states that you don't enjoy, if it feels egregious, but everyone you meet is unwilling to budge on their stance in their decks, they're just going to play what's legal whether you like it or not, that feels sucky. And that frustration intensifies more again when you go online and see people championing pregame discussions and talk with your group as the end-all be-all solution. I get that frustration. That stings. That stinks. The thing is, much like it's unhelpful to blame an individual designer for a company-wide problem, much like it's unhelpful to blame an entire Commander player base for cards they didn't even design, I think it's unhelpful to redirect that frustration about playgroups into such unproductive statements like Rule Zero is a coward move, or what's even the purpose of a rules committee. Those types of statements initially frustrate me to read, but ultimately they just depress me because they're evidence of the result of repeated sadnesses that eventually become anger and eventually become lashing out. I don't even know if it's worthwhile to engage with those types of statements, but assuming they're not just troll questions, if you give me a minute, I'll give it a shot real quick. Like first, okay, what happens if we abolish the rules committee as so many comments suggest? Well, you do that and the current rules become the forever rules. There's no more room to adapt or change as new stuff comes out. No more tweaks can happen to the rules like the commander death rule changes. And that situation sounds more strict to me. It sounds like a recipe for stagnation and decay. No more room for the format to grow and evolve. And given the amount of products that we're getting and new mechanics that are introduced, I think we need room for the format to grow and evolve. On that note, the allegation that no bans is somehow evidence that the rules committee isn't doing anything. The rules committee isn't just a bans committee. Bans are a tip of the iceberg. They are candid about working with wizards behind the scenes to, for instance, make sure that new rules and mechanics won't break stuff. When we get new mechanics like Companion and Learn or acorn symbols, someone's got to figure out how and whether those will integrate into the commander format. Or commanders like Kibo, who make a token with a red mana symbol. What's the deal with color identity there? We all perceive it to be part of Kibo's identity, making him a Gruul commander. But technically, what if in original versions of that card before it saw print, what if that text wasn't written carefully and that red symbol was actually a property of the banana token instead of Kibo himself? That would be unintuitive as heck to the commander player base. So you gotta make sure there's clarity there before cards like that see print. It might sound silly and minor, but those kind of things can happen and they can matter, you know? I also see people say that the format should just be run by Wizards of the Coast directly, and that's just like, oh, I don't like that. I don't think a corporation is going to be a better champion for casual players. And as for the statement, if Rule Zero exists, then why do we even have a rules committee? I don't care for that argument because I find it a little contradictory. If you believe that pre-game discussions don't work, if you believe that commander players can't come to a consensus about which cards they do and don't want to play against, it doesn't make sense to abolish a rules committee because then you're removing the common ground starting point ban list and forcing players to come to a consensus about which cards they do and don't want to play against, which you just claimed doesn't work. So which is it? When I see all those arguments, I don't think people actually want to disband a rules body or anything because that doesn't make sense. But it's not a logical argument, it's an emotional one. There's a problem they keep encountering that isn't yet resolved. And one way that they hope it might be resolved is with, for instance, a stricter rules body, one that bans more things, that bans more cards that they think are the source of that problem. That logic holds in tournament Magic. If Wizards hadn't banned Nadu in Modern, that would have been pretty egregious. But a ban list in tournament Magic is different than a ban list in non-tournament Magic. All that a ban list here is a common ground starting point, some helpful philosophy about stuff that they think makes for a good kick back and enjoy experience, plus a reminder that if you want to flex the rules a little bit for fun, that's kind of neato. But when bans like Nadu happen in other formats and you don't see bans in Commander, it feels like a starker contrast, and that activates all those emotions even more. So, addressing some of those concerns, and just speaking for myself here, I'll say that I don't want more bans. I think something will always be on top in Commander. Nature abhors a vacuum. Something will take its place every time, even if you knock it off that pedestal. The format is fundamentally busted. So I prefer the slower and methodical approaches to bans, because moving too fast can risk becoming whack-a-mole. And I believe that there are other solutions to solve problems in Commander than just banning individual cards. To that point, I also believe there's a lot of strong evidence for the value of things like players self-regulating. For instance, Stasis is one of the saltiest cards in the format according to EDH Rec salt scores, which means people generally don't like playing against it. But it's showing up in fewer decks than this Jace. That's self-regulation at work right in front of our eyes. A lot of egregious cards can, and I believe do, go through a similar cycle like this. Speaking for myself, I've taken a lot of powerful cards out of my deck because I just got bored of them. But getting back on topic here, if the current argument is that Dockside Extortionist has not caught a ban because it appears to be self-regulating, but you personally feel like it is not a card that self-regulates, then make that argument. That is a productive way to channel the frustration, where casting aspersions about Rule Zero and casting assumptions of intent on other people, that is not a productive way to have that conversation. That achieves nothing. Because whenever I see someone claim that Rule Zero pregame chats don't work at all, I feel personally compelled to just gesture broadly at the literal entirety of the CEDH version of the format, CEDH is the most no-holds-barred version of Commander, and when you sit down at a table to play CEDH, what you've just done is speedrun a Rule Zero conversation. Everyone there is on the exact same page about what to expect from the game and what they'll enjoy about it. And from personal experience, when I see a statement like this, where they say a pregame chat takes 10 to 30 minutes, my brother in cardboard, whomst, 30 minutes? This video won't even be that long. Damn, I don't think I've ever been a part of a pregame conversation that took longer than 5. And 5 is honestly, I think it happens in under 2. But again, those kinds of exaggerations aren't logically true, they're emotionally true. Pre-game conversations haven't worked for them, they feel like a massive pain to put up with, so they feel like a lengthy ordeal. And I sympathize, which is why I've made a bunch of videos on this channel about trying to navigate that. And this is another one of them, because this conversation just keeps happening again and again and again, because these players are experiencing bummer after bummer and trying to find an outlet to express that. But you gotta put that energy in the right place, y'all. Michael Majors acknowledged that he was the set lead for MH3 and accepted Nadu as his responsibility, but I'm not gonna call him foolish for any of that. I lay more blame at the lack of time and resources that his team got, and the safe bet direction that he's been constrained to by the company he works for. Constructed players are rightfully bothered by Commander designs having an undue influence on non-Commander formats. But pointing the finger at other players, I think misses the source of the actual problem. And likewise, players who struggle to find enjoyable Commander pods are genuinely bummed about it. That's a real frustration. But casting aspersions about other people for whom pregame chats are successful, that's just plain old scapegoating. Powerhouse cards might feel like the culprits, they might feel like the problem, but whether certain cards are banned is not the only problem or the biggest problem that needs solving. That's a wrong place to put that energy. If I may once again borrow a phrase from friend of the show Dan Sheehan of the Pie Break podcast, it feels like what people are after is a legislative response to a weird guy. But you can't legislate weird guys. Banning in a tournament isn't like banning in EDH. Banning Dockside or Nadu or whatever doesn't stop obnoxious players from playing obnoxiously. I wager that they'll probably behave that way no matter which cards are legal. Banning a card would only be addressing a symptom, not the root cause of the difficulty of finding an agreeable playgroup. Sometimes some stuff warrants a ban, but again, bans are the tip of the iceberg. The underlying issue is something else, and that something else might be something that a rules body cannot address, because you can't legislate a weird guy. There's no rules response in any game about a stubborn or obnoxious player. There can only be a social response. Given all that, it makes me pretty happy when I listen to other Commander luminaries and I hear them discuss what they think the roles of the Rules Committee in Commander should be. For instance, Rachel and Jim have talked on their shows and online about how the Rules Committee could shift its responsibility towards trying to help local game stores establish healthy dynamics for playgroups at Commander nights. That's another type of behind-the-scenes work that we won't see until it's finished, but I'm heartened to hear it because it sounds like an attempt to get to the root cause of playgroup problems, rather than getting caught up in the symptoms. So yeah, Nadu was unequivocally a mistake. A lot of cards are mistakes. I hope that we can differentiate between the healthy ways that Commander can be designed for and the unhealthy ways that it can be designed for. I hope that Wizards stops acting like the movie industry and playing it safe when gauging their audiences. I hope that we can recognize that this isn't a problem with any individual designer or design team, but rather a problem that is coming from the company's direction as a whole. And I hope that players who are struggling with true bummers that make it really hard to enjoy their favorite game can find properly productive ways to express those concerns. Because right now, it's just not productive. That's going to be all from me. A like if you liked, dislike if you disliked, goodbye Nadu, no one misses you. And of course, as I love to say, please remember to EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.